Chapter 1. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. I don't know if that's true, but if I think about rich men that I know, or that I know of, they think they're married. Is it because they want an heir to everything, or they need someone to share it with? Maybe it's true. Maybe it's, on a checklist or something for life that, okay, now I made my money, now I want a wife. I don't know. Maybe it's true. So let me start again. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of somewhat or other of their daughters. So it's like, even if he doesn't know it, when he moves into a neighborhood, all the people in the neighborhood think like, okay, well, he's moving here, so then he's ours. He must marry one of our kids and nobody else's kids, or one of our daughters. My dear Mr. Bennet, said his lady to him one day, have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last? Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. But it is, returned she, for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it. Mr. Bennet made no answer. Do not you want to know who has taken it? Cried his wife impatiently. You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it. This was invitation enough that she didn't need anything else. She wants to tell him. Why, my dear, you must know that Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week. Yay! So, Netherfield is the name of an estate that's nearby the Bennet estate, or near the Bennet estate, and it's saying that it's let, that's renting. Like he's not going to own it, he's just going to stay there for a while. And so there's a man of good fortune, so maybe he wants a wife, like it said in the first line. All right, so he is going to move in. What is his name? Bingley. Is he married or single? Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune. 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls. How so? How can it affect them? I think Dad knows how it can affect them. He's the one who asked if he's married or single. Anyway. So how can it affect them? My dear Mr. Bennet, replied his wife. How can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them. Is that his design in settling here? Is that his plan of settling here, is to get married? Design? Nonsense. How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes. I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will still be better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party. Okay, now I'm not sure if he's flirting with his wife or if he's being sarcastic. Maybe a little bit of both. My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. Well, if he was being sarcastic, she didn't catch it, right? In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of. Oh. Well, yeah. But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighborhood. It is more than I engage for, I assure you. But consider your daughters. Only think of what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go, merely on that account, for in general, they visit no newcomers. Indeed, you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not. The Bennet ladies cannot go to a person's house that they don't know, or a stranger's house, and just go introduce themselves. It's not like, the American thing that you see like from the 1950s where, or even now, I guess, where people get an apple pie and they take it next door to the new neighbors and they introduce themselves and they say, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. It's not like that. The women can't do that here. It doesn't follow the rules of decorum. And so what happens is the men need to go or their caregivers or the head of household, they're the ones that go and introduce themselves, and they get acquainted with the visitors or the newcomers first, and then they go and introduce them to the lady folk later. All right, so that's why they can't go. They know they can't go without dad or a brother or somebody who knows, who goes and introduces himself first. You are over-scrupulous, surely. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls, though I must throw in a good word for my Lizzie. So he's like, no, you guys go, or you girls go, and I'll send a letter. I'll write a letter, and then I'll just tell him in the letter that he can marry whoever he wants, but, I have to put in a good word for Lizzie. I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, and I am sure she is not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so good-humored as Lydia, but you're always giving her the preference. Okay, so now we know where the favorites are. I think Dad favors Lizzie, and Mom at least doesn't favor Lizzie. They have none of them much to recommend them, replied he. They are all silly and ignorant like other girls, but Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters. Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves. You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least. You do not know what I suffer, but I hope you will get over it, and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighborhood. It will be no use to us if 20 such should come, since you will not visit them. Depend on it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. They've been married for 23 years and she still doesn't understand him. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. Yeah, there is really not much to Mrs. Bennet. It's so sad. Chapter 2 of Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. Oh, yes, he was. He has 5 daughters. Of course he has to go and introduce himself to Mr. Bingley so he can introduce Mr. Bingley to his girls. He knows. I think he was just teasing his wife in chapter 1. He had always intended to visit him, though to the last always assuring his wife that he should not go. Until the evening after the visit was paid, she had no knowledge of it. It was then disclosed in the following manner. I love that sentence. It says it was then disclosed in the following manner, telling us, like, hey, this is what the chapter is about. It's going to tell us about how he revealed this information to his family. Observing his second daughter employed in trimming a hat, he suddenly addressed her with, I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie. We are not in a way to know what Mr. Bingley likes, said her mother resentfully, since we are not to visit. But you forget, Mamma, said Elizabeth, that we shall meet him at the assemblies, and that Mrs. Long has promised to introduce him. I do not believe Mrs. Long will do any such thing. She has 2 nieces of her own. She is a selfish, hypocritical woman, and I have no opinion of her. She just gave her opinion of her. And she's saying, and I don't have an opinion of her. Mrs. Bennet is so funny. No more have I, said Mr. Bennet, and I am glad to find that you do not depend on her serving you. Mrs. Bennet deigned not to make any reply, but unable to contain herself, began scolding one of her daughters. Don't keep coughing so, Kitty, for heaven's sake. Have a little compassion on my nerves. You tear them to pieces. This is kind of like when parents argue in front of the kids, or the kids get caught in the crossfire, and the kids get in trouble even though they didn't do anything wrong, just because the parents are in a bad mood. That's what Mrs. Bennet is doing. And then the dad's defending her. She's like, oh, stop coughing, Kitty. And he's like, well, she needs to cough. Let her cough. Kitty has no discretion in her coughs, said her father. She times them ill. I do not cough for my own amusement, replied Kitty fretfully. When is your next ball to be, Lizzie? Tomorrow fortnight. Ah, so it is, cried her mother, and Mrs. Long does not come back till the day before, so it will be impossible for her to introduce him, for she will not know him herself. Then, my dear, you may have the advantage of your friend and introduce Mr. Bingley to her. Mr. Bennet's already dropping hints that he knows Mr. Bennet is already dropping hints that he knows Mr. Bingley. in saying that, oh, well, then I guess you're going to have to introduce him to everybody else, because he knows that he's going to introduce Mr. Bingley to his wife. I mean, she's going to be able to introduce Mr. Bingley to everybody else. Impossible, Mr. Bennet, impossible when I'm not acquainted with him myself. How can you be so teasing? I honor your circumspection. A fortnight's acquaintance is certainly very little. There it is again. He's like, yeah, I guess you're right. Knowing him for 2 weeks is not enough time, to know somebody. So he's telling her, like, we're going to know him for 2 weeks, kind of dropping the hint, like, I already know the guy. The ball's 2 weeks away, and if they know each other for 2 weeks, hello. One cannot know what a man really is by the end of a fortnight, but if we do not venture, somebody else will. And after all, Mrs. Long and her nieces must stand their chance. And therefore, as she will think it an act of kindness, if you decline the office, I will take it on myself. He's like, oh, well, if you don't want to introduce Mr. Bingley to her, I'll do it. Another hint that he knows Mr. Bingley. The girls stared at their father. Mrs. Bennet only said, nonsense, nonsense. The girls know. They understand their dad. They know they're getting his hints, and they're understanding. What can be the meaning of that emphatic exclamation? Cried he. Do you consider the forms of introduction and the stress that is laid on them as nonsense? He's like, whoa, because the dad's like, oh, I'm going to introduce him to everybody or to Mrs. Long, and she's like, nonsense, nonsense. He's like, whoa, are you telling me that the whole idea or the practice that we have of introducing people to each other, that's not important? He's like, of course it's important. What's the matter with you, woman? He says, what can be the meaning of that emphatic exclamation? Cried he. Do you consider the forms of introduction and the stress that is laid on them as nonsense? I cannot quite agree with you there. What say you, Mary? For you are a young lady of deep reflection, I know, and read great books and make extracts. So he asks his second daughter, his third born daughter, Mary, what she thinks. And let's see, Mary wished to say something sensible, but knew not how. She didn't have anything to say. While Mary is adjusting her ideas, he continued, let us return to Mr. Bingley. I am sick of Mr. Bingley, cried his wife. I am sorry to hear that, but why did you not tell me before? If I had known as much this morning, I certainly would not have called on him. It is very unlucky, but as I have actually paid the visit, we cannot escape the acquaintance now. So now that's how he told them. The astonishment of the ladies was just what he wished. Did you hear that? It is just what he wished. He wanted them to react this way. That of Mrs. Bennet perhaps surpassing the rest, though when the first tumult of joy was over, she began to declare that it was what she had expected all the while. How good it was in you, my dear Mr. Bennet, but I knew I should persuade you at last. I was sure you loved your girls too well to neglect such an acquaintance. Well, how pleased I am, and it is such a good joke, too, that you should have gone this morning and never said a word about it till now. Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose, said Mr. Bennet, and as he spoke, he left the room, fatigued with the raptures of his wife. It says that he was fatigued with the raptures of his wife, but he knows what he has. He's been married to her for 23 years. He's the one, I think, who brought this on. He could have just simply said, hey, all right, I went to visit Mr. Bingley, but he chose to disclose it in this manner. So that's a little bit of his fault. He's teasing. Anyway, what an excellent father you have, girls, said she when the door was shut. I do not know how you will ever make him amends for his kindness, or me either, for that matter. At our time of life, it is not so pleasant, I can tell you, to be making you acquaintance every day. But for your sakes, we would do anything. Lydia, my love, though you are the youngest, I dare say Mr. Bingley will dance with you at the next ball. Oh, said Lydia stoutly, I am not afraid, for though I am the youngest, I am the tallest. The rest of the evening was spent in conjecturing how soon he would return Mr. Bennet's visit, and determining when they should ask him to dinner. Because it's, I guess, the rules of decorum, so Mr. Bennet is supposed to go and introduce himself to Mr. Bingley and say, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. Now it's Mr. Bingley's turn to come and visit him and return the visit and be like, hey, hello, thank you for coming the other day. And then after that, there's an invitation to dinner, and things just go back and forth this way. And that's just how it is. Chapter 3 of Pride and Prejudice. Not all that Mrs. Bennet, however, with the assistance of her 5 daughters, could ask on the subject was sufficient to draw from her husband any satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley. They attacked him in various ways, with barefaced questions, ingenious suppositions, and distant surmises, but he eluded the skill of them all, and they were at last obliged to accept the second-hand intelligence of their neighbour, Lady Lucas. Her report was highly favourable. Sir William had been delighted with him. He was quite young, wonderfully handsome, extremely agreeable, and to crown the whole, I love that, to crown the whole, I'm sorry, he meant to be at the next assembly with a large party. Nothing could be more delightful. To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love, and very lively hopes of Mr. Bingley's heart were entertained. So the daughters at the beginning of this chapter, and the mother, Mrs. Bennet, they all wanted to know more about Mr. Bingley. They wanted to know what he looked like, just any information that the dad would offer, but Dad was not offering anything. He's like, nope, not talking about him. I'm not doing this. And so they ended up having to speak with Lady Lucas. And she said, well, when my husband went to visit him, this is what he said, that Mr. Bingley's awesome. He's just like a cool guy. He's handsome, agreeable. And then they said that he's going to go to the next assembly. That's a dance, like a ball. Well, not a ball, it's an assembly. It's a little lower class. But anyway, and it said, to be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love. Falling in love, dancing. But I guess if I think about it, so as a kid, or maybe even as a maybe a teenager, 20-year-old in my 20s, if I went to a dance and somebody came and asked me to dance, I'd be like, oh my goodness, he must have singled me out from all the other ladies here. Why? Oh, do you see what I'm saying? Maybe there is something to that. But as far as falling in love, maybe if you drive well, if you dance well, you follow each other's footsteps, and I guess, right? I don't know. If I can but see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield, said Mrs. Bennet to her husband, and all the others equally well married, I shall have nothing to wish for. In a few days, Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit. You see, Mr. Bingley did return. Hold on, the sun is in my face. Okay, in a few days, Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit and sat about 10 minutes with him in his library. He had entertained hopes of being admitted to a sight of the young ladies, of whose beauty he had heard much, but he saw only the father. Oh, so Mr. Bingley has already heard about the Bennet sisters, and he was like, where are they at, right? The ladies were somewhat more fortunate. But Mr. Bingley was not able to see them. He only talked to the dad that day. And it says here, the ladies were somewhat more fortunate, for they had the advantage of ascertaining from an upper window that he wore a blue coat and rode a black horse. Yay! I guess. An invitation to dinner was soon afterwards dispatched, so now they invited him to dinner. So now it's their turn to do this, and after he goes to dinner with them, he's supposed to invite them to dinner over there at his house. That's just how it goes, right? And now they're social. An invitation to dinner was soon afterwards dispatched, and already had Mrs. Bennet planned the courses that were to do credit to her housekeeping, when an answer arrived which deferred it all. Mr. Bingley was obliged to be in town the following day, and consequently unable to accept the honour of their invitation, etc. Mrs. Bennet was quite disconcerted. She could not imagine what business he could have in town so soon after his arrival in Hertfordshire, and she began to fear that he might be always flying about from one place to another, and never settled at Netherfield as he ought to be. Lady Lucas quieted her fears a little by starting the idea of his being gone to London, only to get a large party for the ball, and a report soon followed that Mr. Bingley was to bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him to the assembly. Lady Lucas, did you hear what it said? So now Mrs. Bennet's like, oh my gosh, he's always going out of town, or he's going to go out of town often. Is that what he's going to do here? Maybe he's not going to stay here. And remember, because she wants him to marry one of her daughters, right? Well, look at what Lady Lucas did. It says here, Lady Lucas quieted her fears a little by starting the idea. She started a rumor. She doesn't even know, right? She started the idea that he went to London just to get this huge party of people to come with him to the dance, right? The girls grieved over such a number of ladies because it said that he was gonna bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen. That's a lot, right? The girls grieved over such a number of ladies, but were comforted the day before the ball by hearing that instead of 12, had brought only 6 with him from London, his 5 sisters and a cousin. And when the party entered the assembly room, it consisted of only 5 altogether: Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of the eldest, and another young man. Where they got this information from, like, that he has 5 sisters. I mean, he does not have 5 sisters, but that was a rumor for a little bit. So, I mean, things just got out of hand with the talking. Gossipers. Mr. Bingley was good looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women with an air of decided fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance of his having 10,000 a year. That's like double what Bingley makes in a year. So, I mean, everybody was excited about Mr. Bingley. Oh, he's a new guy in town. And then he brings his friends, and ooh la la, there's this other guy with him. Move over, Mr. Bingley. Who is this Mr. Darcy? And he makes a lot of money, right? The gentlemen pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man. The ladies declared he was much handsomer than Mr. Bingley, and he was looked at with great admiration for about half the evening, till his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity, for he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased, and not all his large estate in Derbyshire could then save him from having a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance, and being unworthy to be compared with his friend. So it says that he has a disagreeable countenance now, like his face, and I guess the faces that he's making, that he's a proud guy. He's just, what does it say here? He's above his company. Like, he thinks he's too good for everybody. If he has all this money, he makes more than double of what Mr. Bingley makes. But his manners are terrible. They're like, I don't care how much you make. I don't like you. Right? Mr. Bingley had soon made himself acquainted with all the principal people in the room. He was lively and unreserved, danced every dance, was angry that the ball closed so early, and talked of giving one himself at Netherfield. Such amiable qualities must speak for themselves. But a contrast between him and his friend, Mr. Darcy, danced only once with Mrs. Hurst and once with Miss Bingley, declined being introduced to any lady, and spent the rest of the evening in walking about the room, speaking occasionally to one of his own party. So he did not socialize. This is one of those things where it's like, dude, if I'm going to bring you to a party, you better not be boring, and you better not be rude to the people here, because you're cramping my style, dude. That's what Darcy was doing. It's like, just go wait in the car. His character was decided. He was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again. Amongst the most violent against him was Mrs. Bennet, whose dislike of his general behavior was sharpened into particular resentment by his having slighted one of her daughters. So Mrs. Bennet doesn't like him. Like, she really doesn't like him because he kind of insulted one of her daughters. So let's see what happened. Elizabeth Bennet, and it was Elizabeth. Now, I don't think Mom really likes Elizabeth as much as her other daughters. I think she's the least favorite, but you know what? She's still her daughter. She's like, you don't insult my kid, right? I'm going to be upset with you forever now. So look at this. Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged by the scarcity of gentlemen to sit down for 2 dances. Okay, so Elizabeth sat down for 2 dances, which is, I guess, not fun. It's like when you go to a dance and you're at a table with your friends and everybody goes to dance except you, and you're just like, oh, what do I do here? Do I twiddle my thumbs? And luckily now, because we didn't in the 90s, but now you have a phone where you can pretend to be engaged with your phone at least, but no, Elizabeth just sat there for 2 dances. Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged by the scarcity of gentlemen to sit down for 2 dances, and during part of that time Mr. Darcy had been standing near enough for her to overhear a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley, who came from the dance for a few minutes to press his friend to join in. So Mr. Bingley's dancing, he's having a good time. He's like, oh, come on, dude, come dance with us. This is what he says. He says, "Come, Darcy," he said, "I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing about by yourself in this stupid manner. You had better much dance. You had much better dance." "I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it, unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At such an assembly as this, it would be insupportable. Your sisters are engaged, and there is not another woman in the room whom it would not be a punishment to me to stand up with." Oh my goodness. "I would not be so fastidious as you are," cried Bingley, "for a kingdom. Upon my honour, I never met with so many pleasant girls in my life as I have this evening, and there are several of them you see uncommonly pretty." "You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room," said Mr. Darcy, looking at the eldest Miss Bennet. So Bingley's dancing with Jane, and he's like, "Well, she's the only pretty one around here." And he says, "Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I ever beheld. But there was one of her sisters sitting down just behind you who was very pretty, and I dare say very agreeable. Do let me ask my partner to introduce you." He's like, "Oh, well, let me have my dancing partner, Jane, introduce you to her sister. She's right there. She's so pretty." "Which do you mean?" And turning around, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own and coldly said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, and I am in no humour at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me." Oh, Darcy's like, "Why would I dance with her? The other guys aren't dancing with her. She's been sitting for 2 dances. No, why would I do that? They don't want her. Why do I want her?" Mr. Bingley followed his advice. Mr. Darcy walked off, and Elizabeth remained with no very cordial feelings toward him. She told the story, however, with great spirit among her friends, for she had a lively, playful disposition which delighted in anything ridiculous. So she's like, "Oh my gosh, this guy is just out of control. He's ridiculous." So she thought it was funny that he said that. And so she had no problem telling her friends. But if somebody said that about me, I'm like, should I tell people? I mean, I think I'd be a little embarrassed about that. Somebody actually said that about me, right? The evening altogether passed off pleasantly to the whole family. Mrs. Bennet had seen her eldest daughter much admired by the Netherfield party. Okay, the Netherfield party, that's Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the brother-in-law, and Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley had danced with her twice, and she had been distinguished by his sisters. Jane was as much gratified by this as her mother could be, though in a quieter way. Elizabeth felt Jane's pleasure. Mary had heard herself mentioned to Miss Bingley as the most accomplished girl in the neighbourhood, and Catherine and Lydia had been fortunate enough to never be without partners, which was all that they had yet learnt to care for at a ball. They returned, therefore, in good spirits to Longbourn, the village where they lived, and of which they were the principal inhabitants. They found Mr. Bennet still up with a book. He was regardless of time, and on the present occasion he had a good deal of curiosity as to the event of an evening which had raised such splendid expectations. He had rather hoped that all his wife's views on the stranger would be disappointed, but he soon found that he had a very different story to hear. So he was like, let me hear what these ladies have to say. Maybe Mr. Bingley was, some kind of jerk, and, well, he wasn't, so... "Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet," as she entered the room, "we have had a most delightful evening, a most excellent ball. I wish you had been there. Jane was so admired. Nothing could be like it. Everybody said how well she looked, and Mr. Bingley thought her quite beautiful, and danced with her twice. Only think of that, my dear. He actually danced with her twice, and she was the only creature in the room that he asked a second time. First of all, he asked Miss Lucas. I was so vexed to see him stand up with her, but however, he did not admire her at all. Indeed, nobody can, And he seemed quite struck with Jane as she was going down the dance. So he inquired who she was and got introduced, and asked her for the 2 next. Then the 2 third he danced with Miss King, and the 2 fourth with Maria Lucas, and the 2 fifth with Jane again, and the 2 sixth with Lizzie, and the Bullinger. If he had had any compassion for me," cried his husband impatiently, "he would not have danced half so much. For God's sake, say no more of his partners. Oh, that he had sprained his ankle in the first dance." So Mrs. Bennet was just going on and on about Bingley and who he danced with and when he danced with them. And the dad, Mr. Bennet's like, "Dude, stop. This is just outrageous. I don't want to hear any more." "Oh, my dear," continued Mrs. Bennet, "I am quite delighted with him. He is so excessively handsome, and his sisters are charming women. I never in my life saw anything more elegant than their dresses. I dare say the lace on Mrs. Hurst's gown. She was interrupted again. Mr. Bennet protested any description of finery. She was therefore obliged to seek another branch of the subject, and related with much bitterness of spirit and some exaggeration the shocking rudeness of Mr. Darcy. But I can assure you, she added, that Lizzie does not lose much by not suiting his fancy, for he is a most disagreeable, horrid man, not at all worth pleasing, so high and so conceited that there was no enduring him. He walked here and he walked there, fancying himself so great, not handsome enough to dance with. I wish you had been there, my dear, to have given him one of your set downs. I quite detest the man. This is chapter 4 of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. When Jane and Elizabeth were alone, the former, who had been cautious in her praise of Mr. Bingley before, expressed to her sister how very much she admired him. "He is just what a young man ought to be," said she, "sensible, good-humoured, lively, and I never saw such happy manners, so much ease, with such perfect good breeding." Good breeding? Like that's the way he was raised? Or his parents? Like, So I thought about this, and I was like, good breeding. Is that because, like, or is it similar to like when you introduce a friend to your parents, or when you have a date, you tell them who's coming to pick you up or whatever, or who you're going to go pick up. Do your parents ask, "Oh, who are her parents?" or "Who are his parents?" I don't mind it. That's because they want to know where they come from. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I never thought of it that way. And depending on who they come from, is that how they were brought up? Were they brought up like them in that culture, in that manner? Maybe that's what she's talking about. Like good breeding. Like he's polite. He was brought up well, right? He is also handsome, replied Elizabeth, which a young man ought likewise to be, if he possibly can. His character is therefore complete. I was very much flattered by his asking me to dance a second time. I did not expect such a compliment. Did not you? I did for you, but that is one great difference between us. Compliments always take you by surprise, and me never. What could be more natural than his asking you again? He could not help seeing that you were about 5 times as pretty as every other woman in the room. No thanks to his gallantry for that. Well, he certainly is very agreeable, and I give you leave to like him. You have liked many a stupider person. And Elizabeth's like, yeah, I'm gonna let you like him. I agree, because the other guys that you liked were kind of dumb. Dear Lizzie, oh, you are a great deal too apt, to like people in general. You never see a fault in anybody. All the world are good and agreeable in your eyes. I never heard you speak ill of a human being in my life. I wish you would not be hasty. I would wish not to be hasty in censoring anyone, but I always speak what I think. I know you do, and it is that which makes the wonder, with your good sense, to be so honestly blind to the follies and nonsense of others. Affectation of candor is common enough, one meets it everywhere, but to be candid without ostentation or design, to take the good of everybody's character and to make it still better, and say nothing of the bad, belongs to you alone. And so you like this man's sisters too, do you? Their manners are not equal to his. Certainly not, at first, but they are very pleasing women when you converse with them. Miss Bingley is to live with her brother and keep his house, and I am much mistaken if we shall not find a very charming neighbor in her. So Elizabeth is saying to Jane, like, dude, you like everybody. You think everybody's nice. You think it's like you are blind to all of their faults. And she's like, so let me ask you, do you like Mr. Bingley's sisters too? She's like, yeah, they're nice. I think they're going to be nice neighbors. Mr. Bingley's sister is going to be not the housekeeper, but the mistress of the house for now. I mean, he's not married. And she's like, I think she's going to be a good neighbor. Elizabeth listened in silence, but was not convinced. Their behavior at the assembly had not been calculated to please in general, and with more quickness of observation and less pliancy of temper than her sister, and with a judgment too unassailed by any attention to herself, she was very little disposed to approve them. She's like, yeah, no, I watched them at the ball. They're not nice. They were in fact very fine ladies, not deficient in good humor when they were pleased, nor in the power of being agreeable when they chose it, but proud and conceited. They were rather handsome, had been educated in one of the first private seminaries in town, had a fortune of 20,000 pounds, were in the habit of spending more than they ought, and of associating with people of rank, and were therefore in every respect entitled to think well of themselves and meanly of others. They were of a respectable family in the north of England, a circumstance more deeply impressed on their memories than that their brother's fortune and their own had been acquired by trade. So, them being part of a good family or coming from a good, respectable family was more important or more respectable than Bingley making his money through trade. Interesting, right? I mean, it makes me think like here in the United States or in America, we have the American dream where you can come here with just the clothes on your back and $5 in your pocket, and you can make something of yourself. You can be somebody. Or you hear people say, they have the rags to riches story. That's the American dream, right? Well, here it's more like, no, you need to have a respectable family. I mean, yeah, you made your money through trade, I guess. But, you're more respected because of who your family is, which I get. Family is important. Mr. Bingley inherited property to the amount of nearly £100,000 from his father, who had intended to purchase an estate, but did not live to do it. Mr. Bingley intended it likewise, and sometimes made choice of his county, but as he was now provided with a good house and the liberty of a manor, it was doubtful to many of those who best knew the easiness of his temper whether he might not spend the remainder of his days at Netherfield and leave the next generation to purchase. So he has the money to purchase a house. His dad wanted to purchase a house, but the dad didn't do it. Now that Bingley's at Netherfield renting, maybe he's not going to do it, right? Maybe he'll have his son do it when he has kids, right? His sisters were very anxious for having an estate of his own, but though he was now established only as a tenant, Miss Bingley was by no means unwilling to preside at his table, nor was Mrs. Hurst, who had married a man of more fashion than fortune, less disposed to consider his house as her home when it suited her. Okay. So the sisters, I'm not going to say they're mooching off their brother, because he is the brother, right? But what about Mrs. Hurst, his married sister? Like, dude, go with your husband to his house. But it says here that she doesn't mind considering her brother's house as her house. Mr. Bingley had not been of age 2 years when he was tempted by an accidental recommendation to look at Netherfield House. He did look at it and into it for half an hour, and was pleased with the situation and the principal rooms, satisfied with what the owner said in its praise, and took it immediately. Between him and Darcy, there was a very steady friendship, in spite of a great opposition of character. Okay, so pay attention to this. They're going to tell us the differences between Bingley and Darcy, and why they're friends. Okay? Between him and Darcy, there was a very steady friendship, in spite of a great opposition of character. Bingley was endeared to Darcy by the easiness, openness, ductility of his temper, though no disposition could offer a greater contrast to his own, and though with his own he never appeared dissatisfied. On the strength of Darcy's regard, Bingley had the firmest reliance, and of his judgment the highest opinion. Oh, so Bingley really, really trusted Darcy. He really thought highly of his opinion, or he took his opinion all the time, right? In understanding, Darcy was the superior. Bingley was by no means deficient, but Darcy was clever. He was at the same time haughty, reserved, and fastidious, and his manners, though well-bred, were not inviting. In that respect, his friend had greatly the advantage. So they're telling us, like, who has the advantage. So Darcy is smarter, he's clever, he makes more money, but Bingley has better manners. So Bingley was sure of being liked wherever he appeared. Darcy was continually giving offense. And the manner in which they spoke of the Meryton Assembly was sufficiently characteristic. So now they're saying, now that I've told you more about Darcy and Bingley and their characters, so now let's talk about what each are saying about the Meryton Assembly. It goes well with their character, or it stays true to their character. So it says here, the manner in which they spoke of the Meryton Assembly was sufficiently characteristic. Bingley had never met with pleasanter people or prettier girls in his life. Everybody had been most kind and attentive to him. There had been no formality, no stiffness. He had soon felt acquainted with all the room, and as to Miss Bennet, he could not conceive an angel more beautiful. Darcy, on the contrary, had seen a collection of people in whom there was little beauty and no fashion, for none of whom he had felt the smallest interest, and from none received either attention or pleasure. Miss Bennet he acknowledged to be pretty, but she smiled too much. Mrs. Hurst and her sister allowed it to be so, but still they admired her and liked her. They pronounced her to be a sweet girl, and one whom they should not object to know more of. Miss Bennet was therefore established as a sweet girl, and their brother felt authorized by such commendation to think of her as he chose. So they were talking about Jane, that Jane was a sweet girl. Mr. Bingley thinks that she's the most beautiful person he's ever seen in his life. Darcy's like, yeah, she's pretty, but she smiles too much. And the other ones are like, yeah, she's nice. Anyway. Chapter 5, Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen. Within a short walk of Longbourn lived a family with whom the Bennets were particularly intimate. Sir William Lucas had been formerly in trade in Meryton, where he had made a tolerable fortune and risen to the honor of knighthood by an address to the king during his mayoralty. The distinction had perhaps been felt too strongly. It had given him a disgust to his business and to his residence in a small market town, and quitting them both, he had removed with his family to a house about a mile from Meryton, denominated from that period Lucas Lodge, where he could think with pleasure of his own importance, and, unshackled by business, occupy himself solely in being civil to all the world. So Sir William, he was Mr. William, and then he was knighted and became Sir William, and because he was knighted by the king, he was disgusted with, what he did for a living, which was a job in trade. I don't know what he traded, but that's where he made his money. So now he quit his job, moved his family, and went to this nice place and called it Lucas Lodge, and now he sits and just thinks about his own importance. Psst. For though elated by his rank, it did not render him supercilious. On the contrary, he was all attention to everybody, so he was still nice. He wasn't conceited or anything. By nature inoffensive, friendly, and obliging, his presentation at St. James's had made him courteous. Lady Lucas was a very good kind of woman, not too clever to be a valuable neighbor to Mrs. Bennet. They had several children. The eldest of them, a sensible, intelligent young woman about 27, was Elizabeth's intimate friend. Okay, that the Miss Lucases and the Miss Bennets should meet to talk over a ball was absolutely necessary, and the morning after the assembly brought the former to Longbourn to hear and to communicate. I guess we do that, when we have dances, or when we have baby showers or bridal showers, or weddings or quinceañeras or whatever. The next day, we are all at the kitchen table, eating breakfast and talking about who wore what and who danced with who and the music and who drank too much, So, that's what they're doing now. You began the evening well, Charlotte, said Mrs. Bennet, with civil self-command to Miss Lucas. You were Mr. Bingley's first choice. Yes, but he seemed to like his second better. Oh, you mean Jane, I suppose, because he danced with her twice. To be sure, that did seem as if he admired her. Indeed, I rather believe he did. I heard something about it, but I hardly know what. Something about Mr. Robinson. Perhaps you mean what I overheard between him and Mr. Robinson. Did not I mention it to you? Mr. Robinson's asking him how he liked our Meryton assemblies, and whether he did not think there were a great many pretty women in the room, and which he thought the prettiest, and his answering immediately to the last question, oh, the eldest Miss Bennet, beyond a doubt. There cannot be two opinions to that point, or on that point. Upon my word, well, that was very decided indeed. That does seem as if... But, however, it may all come to nothing, My overhearings were more to the purpose than yours, Eliza, said Charlotte. Mr. Darcy is not so well worth listening to as his friend, is he? Poor Eliza, to be only just tolerable. So now they're talking about what Darcy said about Elizabeth. I beg you would not put it into Lizzie's head to be vexed by his ill treatment, for he is such a disagreeable man that it would be quite a misfortune to be liked by him. Mrs. Long told me last night that he sat close to her for half an hour without once opening his lips. I'm telling you, if your friend is gonna go to a party and act like that and not be sociable and just be boring and rude, dude, just wait in the car. Anyway. Are you quite sure, ma'am? Is not there a little mistake? Said Jane. I certainly saw Mr. Darcy speaking to her. Like, no, that's not true. Jane's always so nice and truthful. She doesn't want people to be misrepresented, even if it is Darcy. Because she asked him at last how he liked another field, and he could not help answering her, but she said he seemed very angry at being spoke to. Miss Bingley told me, said Jane, that he never speaks much unless among his intimate acquaintance. With them he is remarkably agreeable. I do not believe a word of it, my dear. If he had been so very agreeable, he would have talked to Mrs. Long, but I can guess how it was. Everybody says that he is ate up with pride, and I dare say he had heard somehow that Mrs. Long does not keep a carriage, and had come to the ball in a hack chaise. I do not mind his not talking to Mrs. Long, said Miss Lucas, but I wish he had danced with Eliza. So there's Charlotte sticking up for her friend, right? Another time, Lizzie, said her mother, I would not dance with him if I were you. Believe me, ma'am, I may safely promise you never to dance with him. There it is. Elizabeth promised to never dance with him, and she promised her mother, all right? His pride, said Miss Lucas, does not offend me so much as pride often does, because there is an excuse for it. One cannot wonder that so very fine a young man, with family, fortune, everything in his favor, should think highly of himself. If I may so express it, he has a right to be proud. Charlotte's like, let him. He can be proud if he wants to. Look at what he has. Look at who he is. That is very true, replied Elizabeth, and I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine. Pride, observed Mary. I love Mary. She's awesome. Listen to this. She doesn't speak very much, but Pride, observed Mary, who picked herself upon the solidity of her reflections, is a very common failing, I believe, by all that I have ever read. I am convinced that it is very common indeed, that human nature is particularly prone to it, and that there are very few of us who do not cherish a feeling of self-complacency on the score of some quality or other, real or imaginary. Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us. Okay. So, I guess people get that word pride mixed up. It says we should not be prideful. Oh, you're not supposed to be proud, but then we turn around and say, oh, I'm proud of you, or, oh, I'm proud of, what you've accomplished, or whatever. So, can we be prideful or not, But I think that's what she's saying, that they get those two, vanity and pride, confused. Vanity, she says, is what we would have others think of us. Like, I want you to think of me a particular way, so I'm going to do certain things to gain your attention, or to get your acceptance, I guess, right? And so that's vanity. And some people overdo it, maybe, and that's what they're talking about. If I were as rich as Mr. Darcy, cried a young Lucas, who came with his sisters, I should not care how proud I was. I would keep a pack of foxhounds and drink a bottle of wine every day. So the boys are like, heck yeah, Darcy's awesome. Then you would drink a great deal more than you ought, said Mrs. Bennet, and if I were to see you at it, I should take away your bottle directly. The boy protested that she should not. She continued to declare that she would, and the argument ended only with a visit. So Mrs. Bennet is arguing with one of the sons, a little kid. It says here, a young Lucas. And the argument only ended with a visit, meaning that they were arguing until the very end. I'm sure it was uncomfortable. And maybe that's even what ended the visit, because that was getting annoying, I'm sure.